Great, thank you very much. So just to start with, just to introduce the Forest 500. So the Forest 500 focuses on the market forces driving tropical deforestation. So we use publicly available data to identify the 500 companies and financial institutions with the power to transform supply chains of palm oil, soy, timber, and cattle, so the commodities that are most associated with tropical deforestation. And what we do is we then assess every year the strength of the policies, if they have any, that these companies and financial institutions have to address both deforestation and human rights in these four key commodity supply chains. And then we publish the results in the report every year, and we make available all of the data for anyone to be able to access and download. So next slide. So we've been doing this for 10 years, and we just launched our 10th report and data set earlier this year. And I'm just going to share a few of the key messages about the role of the finance sector and why it's so important. So even after 10 years of doing this, more than half of the financial institutions we assess, so these are the financial institutions with the greatest leverage to influence company action on deforestation, don't have a single policy on deforestation. We identified more than 6 trillion of finance. So this includes equity, bonds, loans, and underwriting from these 150 financial institutions into the 350 companies that we identify with the largest leverage in these supply chains. So that's a huge amount of finance going into these companies, and yet most of it is not governed by any policy looking at whether these companies are doing anything around deforestation and human rights. Next. So just to highlight some of these financial institutions that I'm sure you've all heard of, with the largest amount of finance into these critical companies who don't have a single policy in place. So JP Morgan, Bank of America, Mitsubishi are the largest, but it's no surprise to see, and you can look in the report for the full list, but it includes Vanguard, BlackRock, State Street, the giants of the finance world, who don't have any publicly available policy in place. Next slide. However, it's not all bad. So some financial institutions have taken action and do have publicly available policies on their websites. So this shows it is possible that some financial institutions are taking this seriously, and they are trying to, and they have made commitments at least to take action. None of the financial institutions score particularly well, but these are the top 10. And this is a score out of 100. And as I said, it covers both the strength of their policy and how well they're reporting on implementing the policy as well. And we generally see that scores on implementation are lower. So even if you achieve the barrier of having policy in place, it's in a whole other ballgame in terms of whether they're implementing it or not. But progress is possible, and it's demonstrated that some are doing it. Next. And particularly just to also, crucially, given the urgency of the situation, so we lose about 10 million hectares of forest each year, 4 million hectares of primary tropical deforestation, and despite all of these pledges and commitments from companies and governments, that's not really going down. We've seen the impacts of climate change. Well, globally, we see more extreme events in other places, and tropical deforestation is critical to that, given its role in emissions, but also in biodiversity and livelihoods. And so crucially, we've seen in the last year that 7 financial institutions, includes Barclays, amongst others, have made significant progress. So where banks do not, or investors don't have policies in place, they have demonstrated that it is possible to introduce such policies and to make quite quick progress in starting to implement those policies as well. So I think that's also cause for optimism. The other thing that we hear quite a lot is barriers to implementation and excuses for inaction. So I also wanted to highlight that there is in-depth, that not only do, as I've shown, some financial institutions are taking action on this and demonstrating to their peers that it is possible, but there is also in-depth guidance and data available that walks through how financial institutions can set a strong policy on deforestation and human rights, how they can use existing data to screen their deforestation exposure, and what they should be doing to then engage companies through active ownership. So going to talk to these companies who they have equity stakes in, and setting requirements as owners, or introducing policies into loan covenants and not lending to those who don't have policies in place, and to then monitor progress in terms of their exposure over time. Next slide. And I think just to set the wider context here and why this is so relevant and a topical story. So both the EU and the UK government have active or about to start reviews on the need to regulate the finance sector on deforestation. So both the UK and the EU have new regulations on imports of deforestation, of commodities linked to deforestation. So the EU Deforestation Regulation and the UK Environment Act. Both of these legislations do not include the finance sector, but both have provisions either in them or interlinked legislation for a review of whether more policy legislation should be implemented or not. So it's a very topical time for the evidence for why financial institutions should be regulated for their financing of deforestation and their role in driving deforestation. There's also a wider increase in mandatory disclosure and reporting requirements more generally on environmental and social risks. So the EU has its new sort of corporate social reporting directive. A number of countries have made the task force on climate-related disclosures mandatory. This is coming. Nature is next on the list, and climate is more likely to include Scope 3 emissions, which includes these supply chains, which is currently not fully required. So the landscape is shifting. Financial institutions will need to start thinking about this, and there's an opportunity to influence regulators and make sure that change is made more urgently and that this issue is addressed. And just before I finish, I think while I focus mainly on deforestation, I did want to highlight human rights as well. And just to note that while performance on deforestation is not great, so as I said, we see that more than half don't have a single policy. Only 15% have a policy that covers all 4 commodities. We see even less when you look at human rights. So only less than 10% of financial institutions have a policy looking at that includes ensuring respect for Indigenous people and local community rights to resources, land, and customary rights. And I think only 1 has a policy on zero tolerance for violence against land defenders. So I think that's just a sobering thought as well, that we can't uncouple deforestation and associated human rights abuses. So there's also the need, when thinking about the impact of financial institutions on deforestation, to also bring the issue of human rights to the fore. And with that, I'll hand over just to say that all the data is available. There's a report each year, and you can access all of the data at forest500.org to download it. And I'll pass on.
Hi there, my name's Jo Moulds. I work for the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, and we're a UK investigative newsroom. So we always publish in partnership with big media organisations like the BBC, New York Times, Le Monde, and so on. And like Fernanda said, I was lucky enough to be a Rainforest Investigations Network fellow last year. The story I worked on for that fellowship was about corruption in the auction of oil and gas blocks in the Congo Basin. And it was finance related. There were definitely illicit flows of money, but most of the story was source based. So actually, I'm going to talk about some of the other reporting that I do for TBIJ. And a lot of my reporting's on fossil fuels and finance, but the skills and the tools are totally transferable to deforestation. So, like I say, I look primarily at banks and other financial institutions, and we think this is kind of impactful work because these kind of organizations really respond to negative media coverage. So I've done a series of stories on HSBC. You can see a few of them here. At the same time that I was writing the first one on the left, the sustainable finance story, some campaigners were doing incredible work bringing HSBC's greenwashing into the public. And we actually heard at the same time from high up sources inside HSBC that there was considerable frustration about becoming known as the greenwashing bank. HSBC then came out with what was one of the most progressive policies to restrict lending to oil and gas. So it was never said explicitly, but it felt like the two things were linked. They were shown up to be greenwashing, and they took this really quite significant action. So these three stories, the one on the left, we basically looked at what HSBC calls sustainable finance, and we drilled into what that actually funds. The second, we were kind of highlighting a situation where it appeared that HSBC was breaking its own climate policy. And the third was pointing out a pretty massive loophole in its climate policy. So next slide, please, Jelter. So this was the sustainable finance story we published with the BBC. And basically, I looked at this big splashy pledge that HSBC made, saying that it would contribute up to $1 trillion in sustainable finance by 2030. And basically, by looking in the pot, looking at what it was counting towards that target, we revealed that billions of dollars being counted towards the target were fueling climate change. And we specifically looked at something called a sustainability linked bond, or SLB. Now, some of you will be very familiar with SLBs, so I'll make it quick. But basically, SLBs are different from green bonds. If a company raises money with a green bond, it has to spend that money on like projects that are designated as green. If a company raises money with an SLB, it can spend it on what it refers to as general corporate purposes. So basically the basic running of the business, any kind of expansion, investment, that money is not ring-fenced at all. The reason it's called sustainable finance is because companies that raise money with SLBs basically agree to certain targets related to sustainability. And if they don't meet them, they have to pay a penalty, which sounds good. The problem is the companies set the targets and the penalties themselves. And when you start looking into them, it seems like the targets are incredibly weak and the penalties are often so low as to be completely meaningless. So we did this story mainly from public data. The document you can see at the top was PwC's assurance report. And I pulled that just from HSBC's ESG Reporting Center. And it was basically assessing HSBC's progress towards this big splashy $1 trillion target. And it was helpfully specific in terms of telling us exactly what kind of products were going into the pot. The document underneath is a bond prospectus for a sustainability-linked bond for an Indian cement company. And you can see it's written in like quite horrible, dense legalese, but there's loads of information in bond prospectuses. They're usually available on the web. And particularly with SLBs, there's all the information that you need in terms of the targets and the penalties. We requested data from LSEG, which is a financial markets data provider. Like, we don't have a subscription to them, but they've got a really helpful press office. And basically, I think I just requested HSBC's SLBs for a certain time period, and they were happy to provide that data. Now, once I was looking at bond prospectuses, you kind of have to assess those targets in the context of what the company does as a whole. So then I was looking at investor presentations, annual reports, and so on. And then you can assess whether these targets are actually meaningful at all. So there was an airline, for example, that had plans to massively increase the number of flights it was doing. And its target was about emissions intensity, i.e. the amount of emissions per flight. So its emissions still could have gone up even if it met its target. And yeah, as well as the airline, we found loads of egregious examples, including a company that was building floating oil rigs that were being used to drill Brazil's Campos oil basin, so something that's known as a carbon bomb. And this company was raising finance with HSBC and calling it sustainable finance. Anyway, since the investigation, we heard from bankers that companies were choosing not to issue SLBs for fear of greenwashing. Issuance of SLBs actually dropped 40%. I should say Bloomberg put out a story about SLBs at around the same time, but we heard from bankers that the combination of our two reports was really impacting this market. And next slide, please. So this was the story pointing out a loophole in HSBC's policy. Bank policies, obviously, you can get from their website. Also, NGOs compile them. So I spend a lot of time on something called oilgaspolicytracker.org, and it sounds like Global Canopy is a place to go to for all the deforestation policies. Writing a story about a loophole in a bank's policy is significantly easier than writing a story about a bank breaching its policy. But I think it's still really it's difficult writing the breaching of policy story because you get kind of caught up in the legal clauses associated with the policy and so on. Those are really valid stories to write. But I think it's really great to do the loophole stories as well, because the potential impact is that the bank, probably under pressure from investors, goes back to the policy, tightens up that policy and closes those loopholes. And that will have a significant ongoing impact in terms of the lending that that bank does. So like I said, HSBC made a big announcement in December 22 to no longer fund oil and gas expansion. You can see the part of its policy here. This was a massive win for campaigners, but there was a pretty big loophole in that it was only applicable to project finance. So, for example, if Total wanted to drill a new oil field in the North Sea, it couldn't raise money from HSBC for that new oil field. But if Total just wanted to raise money from HSBC, it still could do that, even though it's massively expanding oil and gas production. So basically what we did, we calculated how much HSBC has helped raise for oil and gas companies that were expanding production in the year since making that announcement. And again, we requested LSEG data, and we looked at the bonds, loans and share sales that HSBC had been involved in. And we took the fossil fuel expanders list from the very well-respected Banking on Climate Chaos report. And once we had that data, we then talked to investors. So these are like the pension funds and asset managers that hold HSBC shares and hold HSBC debt. And what I've found with all of the bank stories I've done is there is always a group of investors that's pushing the bank to do better on climate. And they might have, I don't know, tabled a resolution ahead, a climate resolution ahead of the AGM or something like that. And if you can find that, then you can find a really useful list of investors. And once you've got that list of asset managers, the people you want to speak to are the head of stewardship or the head of responsible investment. And these people will be usually really clued up on these issues. And what I've found is they've been pretty shocked by our findings and will, bring them up with the bank subsequently, which is pretty significant impact. Anyway, this story ended up being the top story on ITV News at 10, which was really exciting because it's one of the UK's main TV news programmes. It's got an audience in the millions, and it's that kind of mainstream audience. So hopefully you're kind of doing that bit of impact, changing public opinion. And the way we translated a kind of data dense story to TV was by getting this little bit of TV theatre. So obviously we requested an interview from HSBC. They said no, and the ITV News guys were at Davos at the time, so they could doorstep HSBC's chief operating officer and essentially chase him around an inflatable igloo. But Jelter, could you play the video?
In 2022, your bank pledged to stop financing new drilling, Mr. Hinshaw. Was that greenwash? Mr. Hinshaw, has HSBC ever refused to help finance new drilling on the grounds of climate change? Mr. Hinshaw? Mr. Hinshaw? Has HSBC broken the pledge that it made in 2022, Mr. Henshaw? The bank pledged to stop financing or stop help financing new oil and gas extraction and new developments. Why haven't you delivered on the pledge yet? Was it greenwash, Mr. Hinchell?
Thank you. And the final slide.
In 2022,
just to say, yeah, that's it from me. Thank you very much. Please do obviously ask questions at the end, but if there's things that occur to you later, please do get in touch. At the Bureau, we're always up for collaborating with people, but also I'm just happy to provide any pointers if you're keen to do any similar investigations. Cheers. I'll hand on.
I think we might have lost Maddie because of connection issues. Seems like her video's frozen. So maybe I'll go first and then we come back to Maddie once her connection's reestablished. So yeah, I'm gonna just go over a few quick steps on how to uncover the people behind companies. Both Josephine and Maddie are very familiar with this presentation. It's something I do for all our fellows, our investigative fellows. Hey Maddie, I see you're back. We just decided that I'll go first while you reestablish, okay? So it'll be some quick tips. Obviously, we don't have that much time, and this can be a very laborious process. But we also published a methodology story about this, which will go into much more detail. And I think Fernanda will share the link to this new story, which will be followed by more stories about the different aspects of the financing behind environmental wrongdoing and destruction. So when you find a company that you know has been doing some environmental wrongdoing, you want to find out who owns this company, who are the people responsible for it. There's two really important steps to follow. First is to know where it's registered. This can be very deceiving. Some companies are active in other countries than where they are registered. And then also to determine which type of company it is. Some are state-owned, some are publicly owned, which means that people can buy shares. And then a lot of companies will be privately owned. So if the company is state-owned, obviously you know who owns it, it's the state. Publicly owned, you will be able to find information about shareholders on the stock exchange or company website in their annual reports. And for private, it gets very complicated, and that's why I have a specific slide for that. Also, one note, sometimes companies are part state-owned, part private-owned, part public-owned, part state-owned. So yeah, there's a lot of options here. So this is my little Monopoly game of how to uncover private company ownership. This is also on the methodology story that's shared in the chat. I think we could also probably add it to the YouTube description once we upload this video. So basically, if it's a private company, sometimes the owners will be listed in global databases. If that's not the case, you can go looking at the national registry. Lots of national registries have online websites where you can look up companies. If that's not the case, you can look at the national gazettes. Gazettes are publications by states that will have kind of short summaries of when a company is incorporated, sometimes who's the founder, who's the shareholder. Then I have some other options. If these options don't work, I'm not really going to go into more depth because this is a short presentation. But then what happens often is that you'll find an owner in the company documents, but it might not be the actual owner. It might be someone standing in for the real owner, like a proxy. This can be a family member, this can be a friend, this can be a complete stranger that they hire just to represent the ownership of the company. So in this case, I have a small tip, is try to look at their personal and company networks, so Facebook, LinkedIn, or the local equivalents like the Chinese social media, Russian social media. Also look at the listed directors and secretaries of the company. Often when there's a proxy, one of the directors, secretaries, or manager is actual owner. And a really cool tip that I've had some cool successes with when I got stuck is by just looking up the company address where the company is registered. There will often be another company registered at the same address which has the same owner, which has the owner you're actually looking for. Or maybe the house or the building that's at this address is owned by the person that you suspect is the true owner. Then also, obviously, some companies are owned by other companies, which are known as shareholding companies. If that's the case, you can go back to the start. But sometimes these shareholding companies are offshores, foundations, or nonprofits, and I have a separate slide for that. So then there's different kinds of private companies. Their ownership kind of changes. So there's limited companies. There the owners have limited liability. That means that if the company goes bankrupt, each person is only responsible for the amount of money that they put in, not for the whole company. So this means that, otherwise they would also personally go bankrupt. Then there's partnerships. This is often used by law firms, accountants, or lawyers. Here, the partners share the profits, but are also liable for the losses, unlike with the limited companies. Then there's limited liability partnerships, which is kind of a mix between the two. And then there's limited partnerships, which is often used by multinationals. And many of them are actually registered in the Netherlands. The limited partnership is known as a CV. And it's kind of in between a limited liability. It's similar to a limited liability partnership. So as I said in the beginning, like you can look up the companies in national registries, which often have documents that will show you the ownership or the managers. Now, the way these work and how useful they are really depends from country to country, or in some countries from state to state. Like in the US, you have registries per state. Sometimes it's just a name search and you can only use them to verify the existence of a company. Sometimes all the information is free and indexed. Sometimes you can even download the original documents. Sometimes it's very basic information. For some, you have to pay for a subscription or per document. So it really depends on country to country. And then also the functionality of the search work changes as well. So for example, for some, you can look only by company number, which is quite annoying. But what you can do then is you can look up the company on Google or on Open Corporates, which is a free international corporate registry. Well, not registry, more like a database. And they often have the company number. So this way you can then find the company in a local registry. Some also allow you to search by a person's name. It's pretty rare. You have this in the UK, Belgium, Hungary, France, Florida. But for most registries that are online, you have to look by company name. A lot of countries do not have online registries, but then you can look at some regional ones. I've listed some here. And then if you remember in the beginning, here in the bottom right, I said, but I have a C later for when a shareholding company is an offshore foundation or a nonprofit. So I'm going to go over offshores here. Technically, an offshore is any company that is registered in a different country from where their economic activity is taking place. But this term is more often used to refer to tax havens or the companies themselves that are registered in tax havens. So here's a list of some tax havens. What is a tax haven? A tax haven is a country that if you register a company there, you will have, which has economic activity in a different country, you'll have a lot of tax benefits or don't even have to pay any taxes. For example, some of these, you don't have to pay taxes on profit if your profit is not generated inside the country. If your company that you're looking at is owned by a shareholding company that's in a tax haven, you can have some luck with finding out the ownership by going on any of these websites on the right. There's Offshore Leaks, there's OCCRP's ALF platform, and then some have their own, actually have pretty transparent online registry websites like Panama, but you need an account to get access. A more difficult situation to finding ownership is when you get to a company that's registered in the secrecy jurisdictions. These have no guidelines, or they don't have any regulation for companies to say who owns them. This depends on the type of company it is. This depends on the state it's registered in. For example, in New York, if you request incorporation documents from a company in New York, it'll just tell you the name and I think the address, maybe the date, but it won't tell you of any of the people involved. Maybe the secretary, which can be like the lawyer or the notary who helped register the company. Also in the Netherlands, if you set up a foundation, which is kind of like a nonprofit, you don't have to file ownership. Whereas actually the Netherlands has a really good online database for normal companies. And then here's a bit about foundations, nonprofits. This is a really good way for companies also to avoid paying taxes and to hide ownership. There's a lot of countries where companies take advantage of these kinds of constructions. And what's cool is that in the US, now foundations still have to file these tax forms, which are available online. So if you come across a US foundation in your research, you can go to GuideStar or the official IRS website or in the ProPublicus Nonprofit Explorer, and then you can find information about the ownership and the financial dealings of a foundation or a nonprofit. Then I have a few more tricks for when you get stuck. Court documents are super useful. If a company is mentioned in a court document, usually it'll also mention the owner. And often in countries where you don't have a registry for companies, you might be able to get court documents either online or through a source or connection that you have in the courts or in the legal system. Also, a really useful tip is to look at subsidiaries. So if a company you're looking at is based, for example, in Panama, and you can't find out the ownership, but it has a subsidiary in Ireland. In Ireland, there's a requirement to file the ultimate beneficial owner. So if you then go to the Ireland registry and look at the subsidiary, it'll show you who owns the company that's based in Panama. And then also what's really interesting is if you get into companies based in a specific jurisdiction, I like to look at the people that facilitate tax avoidance, the companies that help other companies register in certain jurisdictions, because they often explain all the benefits, and through these explanations you can figure out how this works. So that's it for me. You can, if you have any questions, feel free to reach me. My email is JMEERS, so the first letter of my first name and then my last name @pulitzercenter.org. Maybe Fernanda can put that in the chat as well. And now I will hand it over to Maddie.
Thank you so much, Jelter. So I'm Madeleine Gunger, like Fernanda said. Before joining the Pulitzer Center, I had a chance to be part of the Rainforest Investigation Network as fellow. I was twice fellow and working with a regional outlet called Info Congo, covering the whole Congo Basin. So my second year of fellowship, I work on a collaborative project with another Rainforest Investigation Network fellow called Josiane Quagge, who work for Le Monde. Le Monde is a big international outlets publishing in French and English, based in France. So we started a project, like we had each our own project, and we decided to join our forces because we were investigating almost the same topic, illegal logging, and we wanted to know how companies were launder the timber, because a lot of NGOs said that there were a lot of money laundering using some practice in logging activity to make sure that timber that has been cut legally will be sold as legal timber. So we wanted to know how the system worked, and we joined our forces because, next slide please, in Cameroon, it's a challenging context, like in the whole Congo Basin, with lack of transparency. It's difficult sometimes to get like online registration, like Jelter was mentioning. It's difficult to arrive in a country and see that you have all the company, the registration about the company online, and you get information available publicly. So get information on logging activity, logging company is really complicated in the region, in the whole Congo Basin. And when it comes to Cameroon, you will see many commitment by the state to save the country, to save the forest, to have good governance in place. But when it comes to tracking the illegal activities, what the state is doing to really manage the forest is really difficult. So how did we manage to get information to know how the illegal logging or the system behind these practices were going on? We had to go through a lot of process. There are a lot of NGOs who investigate logging activity in the country and in the region. So we had to go to their website to download a couple of reports, like you will see in the screen, like images of a ton of documents that we download from different websites of NGO, including websites from the government, like reports. Sometimes in those reports, you will find information about company conveyance of illegal practice, but it's not like all the information in one single place. And most of the time, when it comes to information from officials, like from the government about illegal activity or a company sanction of illegal activities, those will be report that will be scanned, like scanned document that you have to scrape and use it to build another database. So we got this kind of document that was difficult to analyze using online tools, and we had to scrap those documents to get information about companies in the last 10 years that were involved in illegal activities at official level, like government recognized them as company involved in illegal activities. with that database, we have to combine with other database in Cameroon. The good thing that we have is that we have the Forest Atlas, where you can see information on forest company who has logging activities on protected areas. So this is an online database called Cameroon Forest Atlas, where you can download data about forest management and everything, not the ownership of the company, but the land use. You can have a clear view on how the land, when it comes to forest governance, how you, which company is involved in which area. So we download this data from the Cameroon Forest Atlas to combine with the report from the Ministry of Forest that were in scan document to see that companies who were receiving logging title were also the same company convinced of illegal activities. And from year to year, they were still the same company receiving large portion of forest to do their logging activities. With that information, we also had to map with what the communities will say. Next slide, please. Yeah. So we also had to combine with what the communities were saying, like and using all other database like Global Forest Watch to see where we have like tree cover loss in some specific area. And when we combine all these data on companies convicted of illegal logging, company receiving logging title in the different years, we realized that the company receiving logging title were the one convinced of illegal logging. They were the one convinced the past year of illegal logging. So it's like they were not sanctioned at real for their laundering activities. And when we went on field with the communities, we tried to also cross-reference, and how the system works is that some company will receive logging title, and then when they will arrive in one specific area, they will cut the wood out of the area that the government gave them to do their logging activities. And that will happen with the complicity of many people in the system. Like sometimes the communities will show them some trees to cut, and they will give some money to the community, but also at the point of transporting the wood, they will use fake document to transport the wood and show that this wood is coming from the portion of land that government granted me for logging activity, when it's not the case. And during their transportation, they will have a lot of complicity with official who they will pay some official, or they will use their influence to ask for their truck to pass without any control. So when we had all these information, we published 7 collaborative investigation. Next slide, please, Jelter. We published 7 collaborative. The other one, the next one, 7 collaborative investigation simultaneously by 2 different outlets, Info Congo and Le Monde. And after the publication of these stories, this investigation, RFI, which is one of the most listened radio station in Africa, in Francophone countries, it's a French-based media outlet that most of you know. They took the main finding of our investigation and highlighted in the podcast. And directly 5 days after the publication, the Ministry of Forest reacts and said that the forest checkpoint to have to reinforce the control. So it was like a first time, one of the first time in Cameroon that you will publish an investigation showing some wrongdoing, and the government would not complain that no company are not doing this. There is not cases of illegal logging being transported over the country, but they recognized that there was something going on wrong, and they said that forest checkpoints should reinforce the control. And one lesson is that working on money laundering, when it comes to environmental issue, environmental degradation, the collaboration is the key. Joining forces, having regional outlet, national outlet with international outlets, it expands the reach. Because if you use all the data, everything, and is the distribution plan is maybe just one specific target audience, it will not have the same reach as if you join the forces with diverse outlet to reach more diverse audience. So that's what I can share. Thank you so much. I will give it on to Fernanda.
Thank you so much to all of our amazing panelists. Over to questions now. The first one goes to Helen. Helen, in the Forest 500 report, there's a long list still of companies and financial institutions that after a decade have yet to publish deforestation commitments or policies. How do you think that reporters and the media can continue to pressure those and other companies through their reporting? What can they expose? How can they build new databases? Things like that.
So I think there's two ways to have impact here. It's a great question. I think firstly, it's to make the case for regulation, because I think, as we've shown, after 10 years of inaction, there's this steady middle sort of group that haven't shifted, and there is the opportunity, I think, for regulation, but it's definitely not a given. And so I think, there's elections coming up in the EU and the UK where there's opportunities for regulation. So I think making the case for why that's important, especially in the context as we've seen in the EU, with a lot of backsliding on green policies and the Green Deal. So I think keeping in mind that, and also thinking about public sentiment, whenever we do polling around public opinion on this, it's always very positive. So I think trying to highlight where there is support for action here would be very helpful. And then I think a little bit to what Josephine talked about as well, we continually see that where pressure is put, so we've got examples of where shareholder activism has led to changes in policy, and a lot of that comes from public pressure or media stories. So they are quite sensitive to their public opinion, and we've seen that through Make My Money Matter. I've done quite a few campaigns around deforestation and pensions with Richard Curtis, and thinking about people's exposure to deforestation in their pensions, and that's led to a working group of pensions in the UK work to assess their deforestation exposure, and a number of them have now adopted policies. So I think, very similar to what Josephine says, I think if you can put it in the spotlight, and I think the areas to think about are links to where they're financing where they shouldn't be. So Barclays is a core example of someone who said that they won't be financing certain things, and then they continue to finance it, and calling that out is really, really important. And then the other one is loopholes in policies, where we see things that only, we've got a great policy, but it only counts for palm oil, and showing that actually they're financing a huge number of beef companies that are having even more of an impact. So I think, those stories, very similar to what Josephine showed is possible in oil and gas, is possible in deforestation, and has shown to have impact. And we've seen that even this year, the fact that 7 have rapidly increased their score. The reason they've done that is in part because of external pressure and optics. Hopefully that answers the question, but happy to take more.
Great, thank you very much. And I encourage everyone in the audience to continue sending questions in our Q&A button. The next question is for Jelter. If there's a type of a certain roadmap that every journalist that wants to follow the money, what are the first 3 steps that this journalist can take?
So I would say try to uncover the company ownership of any of the companies involved, which is what I went over today. Secondly is looking at the supply chains. Often there's products involved when it comes to environmental destruction or wrongdoing, whether it's beef, palm oil, soy products. Collagen is one of the attendees here has uncovered, Lilia Mendonça. So yeah, looking at supply chains, seeing where is the product going, and who's buying the product, where does it end up in the consumer market. Whenever you find this consumer link, it really brings a story home for people. It becomes less abstract, the deforestation in the Amazon or the destruction of coral reefs somewhere across the world tied to ships that are doing overfishing. It really brings stories home for people. And then a third one, I think, is what Helen and Joe have really shown today, is to look at the financiers. That's something that in general, I think, is undercovered. And it's, you know, one of the biggest enablers, and it's always tied to regulation and to lobbying and to politics and international policies. So I think that, yeah, those are the three main ways to look at the finance behind environmental wrongdoing.
Great, thank you. The next question is for Josephine, and it's talking a little bit about the challenges, right? So when you're following the money and you face a wall, how normally do you go around this? Have you developed certain mechanisms? If you could even share a case where you were down in one path and had to readjust, so kind of telling the journalists here how they can adapt their reporting strategies.
Sure. I think one of the biggest obstacles is the banks themselves. So at the Bureau, we've written lots of stories about the banks, you know, fraud, money laundering and whatever, and their response tends to be no comment, and you publish the story, what have you. The minute you write about sustainability issues, so many of them put that really core to their brand. They come back with really robust responses. And so you have to be really, really solid on your reporting, even before sending out the right to replies. Obviously, you would be anyway, but just be prepared for quite an aggressive response back from the banks, because we've had situations where they've denied things that we knew were true because we had, you know, the receipts. And then they've changed their story gradually as you say this. So that can be really hard, but, you know, you just need a good editor behind you. And often, like, I kind of pre-prepare our partners saying, this is what the bank is going to come back and say, and this is why our story is still valid. Because quite often these things happen a few days before publication. And so you really have to move quite quickly, and you have to be prepared for that.
Great, thank you. And the final question goes to Madeline. Is when you're following the money, how do you diversify your sources? So you're looking at receipts, you're looking at lots of databases. Are you also partnering with NGOs, academics? How do you build kind of the allies of your story?
Thank you for the question. When working on the Follow the Money, I think we have a diverse range of sources. It's always good to cross-reference. Sometimes it could be academicians, sometimes it could be NGOs. In most of the NGO report, you will see complain about what the company, the wrongdoing of the company. When it comes to academicians, you will see maybe more technical information about a specific area where the company is working, or the type of forest where the company is working. And you will use that, but also use information from the officials about maybe the land area they granted to the company, or the surface area they granted to the company, and why, when. All this contextual information help you to understand what is the level maybe of the involvement of that company, and how this impact the community, maybe the surrounding community who maybe lost their land because of the arrival of this logging company, or this mining company, or this agribusiness company. That you have to cross-reference data from scientists, but also take into consideration how this impacts, what is the injustice in this system, like who is losing and who is gaining from all this type of situation.
Great, thank you. And now I invite all of our panelists to do a round of final remarks, a message that you want everybody to leave the webinar with. Maybe we can follow the presentation order, starting with Helen.
So I think key final messages from me is, one, it's really important and can have tangible impact and change. So please do this. And the other is that there's always more data than you think. So do reach out, like on Forest 500. We're very happy for anyone to contact us and to help you navigate the data and share maybe more data than there's available behind the scenes. So yeah, there's always data, more data than you think, and it's a very important pathway for impact.
I agree with Jelter. It feels like the kind of financing of environmental destruction is underreported. So I would love to see more stories about banks breaking their deforestation policies and also the massive loopholes in those policies, because I know loads of the biggest banks actually do have deforestation policies, and you can just look at what they finance and they are quite clearly breaking those policies. But if I can help at all, please give me a shout.
Yeah, I think I agree with the points that were mentioned already. I think I'm just gonna give one more tip. If you get stuck on your research, another really cool way to find out stuff is that a lot of companies they upload their presentations from conferences. So if you do like a Google search where you use file type PPTX or any kind of other presentation format or PDFs, you can find out some really interesting insider information that can be very helpful in your investigations. Maddie?
Yes, I will end with like the collaboration. We have a huge opportunity here to have a lot of journalists, a lot of NGO working on diverse range of perspectives around the money laundering or follow the money. When you are looking for information, try to map the sources and reach out to organization who has expertise and who can help you to get information you are looking for. Thank you.
Thank you all. But we do have a very last minute question. I think we have the time to address it. It comes to Joe. And this participant would like to know if you could tell more about how you analyzed the bonds that you mentioned. Do you have some keywords or other tools to observe more profoundly the financial info that you were looking for?
So in the bond prospectuses, I mean, you're looking for KPIs, targets, stuff like that. You do have to read quite a lot of boring stuff that will take a while. There's a lot of kind of jargon in terms of, so the interest rate on the bond is often referred to as a coupon. So if you search for coupon, that will generally take you to the bit where it talks about the penalty, because the penalty on sustainability linked bonds is usually a like increase in the coupon. Having looked at quite a lot of these, I'm really happy that if you come to these kind of questions, if you just email me, I can definitely help out, because I want to see more stories like that out there.
Amazing. Thank you all so much. And thank you to our audience for coming.
Thank you.
Thanks.